The missing camper. The wind howled through the frozen trees, rattling our tents like something trying to claw its way inside. The cold was unbearable, cutting through our layers of clothing like blades of ice. We were 5, me, Ryan, Lucas, Jake, and Tom, college friends who thought winter camping in the mountains would be an adventure. We were wrong. The night before it happened, we sat around a weak fire, the flames barely holding their own against the biting wind. Tom had gone quiet, staring into the distance beyond the trees. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We all stopped, listening. The only sound was the wind screaming through the branches. Lucas laughed, shoving him. "You're just trying to scare us, man." But Tom wasn't laughing. I swear. I heard someone whisper my name. None of us took him seriously. We were tired, half frozen, and desperate for sleep. One by one, we crawled into our sleeping bags, and the wind outside continued its eerie song. When I woke up, everything was wrong. The fire had burned out, leaving nothing but a pile of blackened wood. The air was colder than before, the kind of cold that burns when you breathe it in. I sat up and looked around. Something felt off. That's when I noticed Tom's tent. The flap was open, the inside empty. "Tom?" I called out, but my voice felt too small in the vast silence of the forest. Ryan, Lucas, and Jake stirred awake, their faces shifting from groggy confusion to realization. "He probably just went to take a piss," Jake muttered, rubbing his eyes. But we all knew. No one just walks off alone in weather like this. And his boots were still inside the tent. Then we saw the footprints. A single trail of deep, perfect imprints in the snow, leading away from the camp. They stretched into the forest, vanishing into the white void between the trees. But what stopped us cold was the fact that there was only one set of footprints, leading away. No return prints. Ryan cursed under his breath, pulling his coat tighter around him. Maybe he wandered off, got turned around, without his boots, in the middle of the night. Lucas shook his head. We had no choice. We followed the prints, calling Tom's name into the emptiness. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. The wind had died down, and the silence felt unnatural, suffocating. The trees loomed over us, their frost-covered branches reaching down like twisted fingers. I felt a weight in my chest, a primal instinct screaming at me to turn back. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a clearing. In the center stood something that made my blood run cold. A tree, stripped bare, its trunk covered in strange, jagged markings. At its base, the footprints ended abruptly. Just stopped, as if Tom had vanished into thin air. Jake's voice was barely a whisper. "Where the hell is he?" Ryan stepped forward hesitantly, scanning the ground. No signs of struggle, no blood, nothing. It's like he just... The whisper cut him off. Low, almost carried by the wind, yet distinct. "Go back." We spun around, eyes darting between the trees. There was no one there. Lucas pulled out his flashlight and swept it across the forest. The beam trembled as it passed over the twisted branches, the uneven ground. And then it landed on something that shouldn't have been there. A figure. Standing between the trees, too far to make out the details, but undeniably human-shaped. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, watching us. "Tom?" I croaked, but I knew it wasn't him. The figure moved. Not walked. Moved. 1 second it was standing still, the next it was closer. No sound. No footprints in the snow. "Run!" Ryan screamed, and we did. We sprinted back through the woods, our breath coming out in panicked gasps. The camp was barely visible through the trees when I heard something behind me. A whisper right by my ear. Too late. I didn't look back. I couldn't. We crashed into our camp, scrambling into the tents, zipping them up as if thin fabric could keep whatever it was outside. The next few hours were hell. We sat, huddled together, weapons in hand, knives, hatchets, anything that could give us a chance. But the thing never came. Morning arrived in a haze of exhaustion and terror. The forest was quiet, painfully normal, but Tom was still missing. We packed up in record time, abandoning everything we couldn't carry. We needed to get back to civilization, to people. As we reached the main trail, Lucas let out a sharp breath. "Guys, look." We turned. There, in the snow just a few feet away, another set of footprints had appeared. Not Tom's. They were larger, deeper, and they circled our entire campsite. Someone, something had been standing there all night, watching us. We never found Tom. The search teams never found any trace of him either. No tracks, no signs of a struggle, nothing. It was like he had never existed. But we know what we saw. And sometimes, in the dead of winter, when the wind howls through the trees, I swear I can still hear that whisper. Go back. Story number 2. Whispers in the Blizzard. The storm came faster than we expected. One moment, we were hiking through the snowy trails, laughing about how insane we were to go camping in winter. The next, the wind turned vicious, howling through the trees like a warning we didn't understand. The snow thickened, swallowing the path behind us, erasing our footprints as if we had never been there. "We need to find shelter," Ryan shouted over the wind. His voice barely reached me. I could see the panic in Lucas's eyes as he clutched his coat tighter. The cold was sinking into our bones, turning our breaths into thick clouds. Jake fumbled with the map, but it was useless. Whiteout conditions had turned everything into a swirling void. Then we saw it. A dark shape in the distance, barely visible through the blizzard. A cabin. We moved fast, stumbling through the knee-deep snow until we reached the door. It was old, the wood warped with age, the handle cold as ice. Jake shoved it open, and we spilled inside, gasping, shaking, our clothes stiff from the frost. The door slammed shut behind us on its own, rattling in the wind. Inside, the air was stale, the kind of heavy stillness that presses against your skin. A fireplace sat in the corner, long dead, its ashes frozen solid. Dust covered every surface. A single table stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by 4 mismatched chairs. An old, rusted lantern sat on top. But there was no sign of anyone. No food, no blankets, nothing to suggest this place had been used in years. Lucas rubbed his hands together, trying to shake off the cold. "Do you think it's abandoned?" Ryan nodded. "Looks like it. But at least it's shelter. We'll wait out the storm here." We gathered in the center of the room, lighting the lantern for warmth. Shadows stretched along the wooden walls, flickering with each gust of wind outside. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Soft, almost drowned out by the storm. A voice. I turned to Lucas. "Did you say something?" He frowned. "Number Y?" I shook my head. Maybe I imagined it. The wind, the exhaustion, it was messing with my head. Then Jake stiffened. His eyes darted to the far corner of the room near the fireplace. "Guys, did you hear that?" A low murmur. Faint, yet unmistakable. Like someone speaking just beneath the sound of the storm. Ryan stood up abruptly, his eyes scanning the room. "Hello?" His voice echoed slightly, met with nothing but silence. Another whisper. This time, it was clearer. Get out." The words slithered through the air, sending ice through my veins. Lucas jumped to his feet. "Okay, no. What the hell was that?" Jake grabbed the lantern and shone it toward the fireplace. The light barely reached the dark corners of the room. The whisper came again, louder this time. It wasn't just one voice. It was many. "You shouldn't be here." I could feel my pulse hammering against my skull. The air had changed. It felt thicker, heavier, pressing against my skin. The temperature dropped, colder than it had been outside. Then the floor creaked. We all turned at once. A figure stood at the far end of the room, not standing, hanging. It was barely visible in the dim light, its head tilted to the side in an unnatural way, arms limp, feet not touching the ground. A breath hitched in my throat. My body locked up, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, their words twisting into each other. "You have to leave." Ryan grabbed my arm. "We need to get out of here now." But the storm outside was worse than before. The windows were frosted over, the door groaning under the weight of the wind. Lucas was shaking. "We're trapped." Then, the figure moved. It didn't step forward. It shifted like a shadow slithering through the darkness. The whispering voices turned into a chorus of pleas. "Go. Go. Go." Jake lunged for the door, yanking at the handle. It wouldn't budge. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in. The lantern flickered violently, casting shadows that didn't match our movements. Then, right behind me, right at my ear, a voice that was no longer a whisper. "You're too late." The lights went out. Panic exploded in the darkness. Ryan cursed, Lucas shouted, Jake banged on the door. I fumbled in the black void, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The whispers were everywhere now, circling us, overlapping, merging into a distorted hum. Something touched my shoulder. I screamed, shoving back, colliding into Ryan. His breathing was ragged. "I felt it too," he gasped. Then the door slammed open on its own, revealing the raging blizzard outside. We didn't think. We ran. The cold hit like a wall of knives, but I didn't care. I stumbled through the snow, heart pounding, lungs burning. We didn't stop running until the cabin was just a distant shadow in the storm. When we finally collapsed onto the main trail, gasping for breath, we turned back. The cabin was gone. No structure, no footprints, just an unbroken expanse of snow. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. We hiked back in silence, the storm breaking as suddenly as it had begun. The sky was clear by the time we reached civilization, the sun casting long shadows across the untouched snow. To this day, I don't know what we saw. I don't know who or what was whispering in that cabin. But sometimes, in the dead of winter, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear it. You're too late. Story number 3. The Pale Man by the Fire. The fire wasn't mine. That was the first thing I realized when I woke up. The air was sharp with cold, my breath rising in slow, ghostly puffs. The forest around me was silent, buried under a thick layer of snow. My fingers were stiff, my toes numb inside my boots. But the fire was burning strong. Too strong. I sat up, my pulse quickening. When I went to sleep, my fire had been weak, barely enough to keep me warm through the night. But now, it roared, crackling and spitting embers into the darkness. And then I saw him. A man sat across from me, just beyond the flames. His face was pale, almost sickly, the kind of color you see on something left in the cold for too long. His skin stretched too tight over his cheekbones, his lips thin and cracked. He wore a tattered coat, the kind people wore decades ago, the fabric stiff with ice. His hands, bony and long, rested on his knees as he stared at me, unblinking. "You're late," he said. My stomach nodded. My mind fought to make sense of the situation. I hadn't heard anyone approach. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign that he had walked into my camp. And yet, he sat there like he had always been there, like he had been waiting. I don't know what you mean," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The man tilted his head just slightly. The firelight flickered over his face, casting deep shadows in the hollows of his eyes. "You don't remember, do you?" A wave of nausea rolled through me. The way he spoke, the way he looked at me, it was like he knew me. But I didn't know him. I would have remembered him. I glanced around, looking for anything, my knife, my pack, something to ground myself. But everything felt off. The trees stood too still. The wind had died, leaving the air heavy with silence. The fire's glow didn't reach far, as if the darkness beyond it was swallowing the light. I forced myself to speak. "Who are you?" He smiled. His lips cracked, but no blood came out. "You already know." I didn't. But something deep in my bones told me I should. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move, to stand, to step back. But the moment I shifted, the fire dimmed. The warmth drained away as if something was sucking the heat from the air. His smile faded. "You shouldn't do that." I stopped. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. "Sit," he said. I didn't. His eyes darkened, sinking into the hollows of his face. "Do you know what happens to those who don't listen?" Something moved behind him. A shape, shifting in the darkness beyond the fire. My breath caught in my throat. The air thickened, pressing against my skin. "You came here for a reason," he said. "You don't remember, but you will." I clenched my fists. "I didn't come here for you." His expression remained blank. "Number, you came for the fire. But the fire wasn't yours, was it?" A shiver ran down my spine. I looked at the flames, at how unnaturally bright they burned, how they didn't crackle like normal firewood. It was wrong. All of it was wrong. "You took my place," he murmured. The words didn't make sense. I shook my head. "I don't know what you're talking about." He leaned forward. "Yes, you do." The thing in the dark moved closer. I saw it now, just beyond the fire's edge, a towering figure, its limbs too long, its body shifting like mist. Its fingers twitched, curling, reaching. I stepped back. The man didn't move. "You were supposed to freeze," he said. "You were supposed to die." The fire flickered. My skin burned with cold, my breath turning ragged. The world started to tilt, memories rushing in. The storm, the cold biting into my skin, the fire dying in the night, my body too weak to move. I had been dying. But then, the fire had come back. I looked at him. Realization settled like ice in my veins. "You were here before me." He nodded slowly. "And now I'm not." The darkness behind him pulsed. The thing moved again, shifting closer, its breath a deep, hollow rasp. I understood now. The fire wasn't mine. It had been his. I stole his place. The cold seeped into my bones, deeper, harsher. The fire dimmed again. The man stood. The thing behind him loomed closer, hungry. I couldn't breathe. "What happens now?" His lips curled, just slightly. "A trade." The fire roared back to life. The heat rushed through me, burning away the cold. I gasped, stumbling forward, toward the fire, away from the thing. The pale man didn't move. The creature's fingers curled around his shoulders. He didn't fight it, didn't scream. He just watched me, eyes hollow, mouth barely parting as the darkness swallowed him whole. The fire crackled. The cold faded. I was alone. The next morning, I found footprints circling my campsite. Not mine. I didn't stay to see what would happen when night fell again. Story number 4. The Hunter's Cabin. The storm was getting worse. The wind howled through the trees, dragging thick curtains of snow across the path, erasing our footprints before we could take another step. The temperature had dropped so fast that even with our winter gear, the cold gnawed at our bones, slowing us down. Ryan kept checking the map, but it was useless. Nothing but white surrounded us. "We need to find shelter," Lucas muttered, his breath coming out in jagged clouds. That's when we saw it. A cabin, barely visible through the dense snowfall. It sat at the edge of the forest, old and weathered, its roof sagging under the weight of ice. A single window, frosted over, glowed faintly in the dark. Jake was the first to move. "We don't have a choice," he said. "We either freeze or take our chances in there." The door was heavy, the wood swollen from years of neglect. I pushed against it, and it groaned open with an awful creak. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something rotting. A fireplace sat in the corner, its embers long dead. Animal heads were mounted along the walls, their glassy eyes dull, their fur covered in frost. "Looks abandoned," Ryan muttered, stepping inside and rubbing his hands together. Lucas shined his flashlight across the room. A wooden table stood in the center, scratched and worn. A single chair was pulled away from it, as if someone had just been sitting there. The worst part was the walls, covered in carvings. Crude, jagged symbols etched deep into the wood. Some looked like eyes, others, faces. "This place gives me the creeps," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake shrugged off his pack and threw himself onto an old couch, sending up a cloud of dust. "Creepy or not, it's warm." That was the last moment I felt safe. The first sign that something was wrong came an hour later. We had managed to get a small fire going, warming our frozen limbs. The wind outside had gotten worse, rattling the windows like something was trying to get in. That's when we heard it. A slow, rhythmic scraping. We all froze. The sound was coming from inside the cabin. I turned, my flashlight sweeping across the room. The noise had stopped. Lucas glanced at me, his face pale. "Did that come from—" The scraping returned. This time, louder. It was coming from the walls. Ryan stepped forward hesitantly, running his fingers over the carvings. His face twisted in confusion. These weren't this deep before. A gust of wind slammed against the cabin, shaking the walls. The fire flickered violently, almost dying out. In the dim light, the carvings looked different, deeper, sharper. Some had changed entirely, shifting into shapes that looked almost human. Then something knocked from inside the wall. I stumbled back. What the hell was that? No one answered. We stood there breathing heavily, the silence stretching until Lucas whispered, "We need to go." Jake grabbed his pack. "Screw this. We'll find another way out of this storm." He barely made it to the door before the wind slammed it shut in his face. Ryan grabbed the handle and yanked. It didn't budge. He tried again, harder. The door wouldn't move. It was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Then we heard footsteps. Not outside. Above us. Slow, deliberate, pacing across the ceiling. Jake grabbed his pack. "Screw this. We'll find another way out of this storm." He barely made it to the door before the wind slammed it shut in his face. Ryan grabbed the handle and yanked. It didn't budge. He tried again, harder. The door wouldn't move. It was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Then we heard footsteps, not outside, above us, slow, deliberate pacing across the ceiling. My breath hitched in my throat. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the steady, measured steps overhead. Then they stopped, right above where I stood. A whisper brushed against my ear. "You're in my seat." I bolted away, my heart slamming against my ribs. The fire flared up suddenly, casting sharp shadows across the walls. That's when I saw it. The chair. The one that had been pulled away from the table when we entered. It had moved. It was now pushed back in place, tucked neatly under the table, as if someone had just stood up. Jake cursed under his breath, stepping away. "This isn't right. This isn't..." A sharp, splintering crack came from the ceiling. The wooden beams groaned under a sudden weight. The footsteps started again, faster this time, circling above us. Something was in here with us. Lucas fumbled for his flashlight, pointing it at the ceiling. A stain had formed, dark and wet, spreading across the wood. A drop landed on the table. It was red. A low creaking noise filled the room. The mounted animal heads on the walls turned, all at once, their dead eyes locking onto us. The air grew thick, suffocating. Then the whisper returned. "You shouldn't be here." The fire died instantly, plunging the cabin into darkness. Panic exploded through me. I grabbed my pack, fumbling in the pitch black. I could hear the others moving, breathing heavily, trying to find the door. Then the chair scraped across the floor. Something moved beside me. A hand, cold, bony, brushed against my arm. I screamed. The others must have felt it too, because suddenly everyone was shouting, scrambling, pounding on the door. The footsteps overhead thundered, growing erratic, circling, moving faster and faster until the door flew open. The storm howled, but we didn't hesitate. We ran. Snow stung my face, my legs burned, but I didn't stop. None of us did. We didn't look back. We just ran as fast as we could, as far as we could, until the cabin was lost in the blizzard. We found the road by sheer luck. A ranger spotted us the next morning, half frozen, delirious. When we told him about the cabin, his face darkened. "There hasn't been a cabin up there for years," he said. "Burned down in a fire back in the 60s. Hunter went crazy. Said something was living in the walls." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that we had been inside it. But when we went back, there was nothing there. Just an empty clearing, the snow untouched. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear it. That whisper. You were in my seat. Story number 5. The woman in the window. I woke up to a woman screaming. The sound cut through the howling wind, distant but sharp, carried by the icy air. My body tensed as I sat up in my tent, my breath visible in the freezing night. The forest around me was dead silent, the snow-covered trees standing like frozen shadows. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Then I heard it again. A blood-curdling scream somewhere deep in the woods. I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart pounding. My first thought was that someone was in trouble, maybe lost in the storm. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the bitter cold. My boots crunched in the snow as I turned, scanning the darkness. The sound had come from deeper in the forest, past the trail I had taken earlier. The smart thing would have been to stay put, to wait until morning. But another scream shattered the silence, this time closer. I had to go. I grabbed my coat, my flashlight, and my knife, just in case. The snow was deeper than I expected, slowing me down as I trudged through the trees. The wind carried strange sounds, whispers that could have been the storm, or something else. Then, through the thick snowfall, I saw it. A house. It stood alone in the clearing, its roof weighed down with years of snow, its windows dark and empty. It didn't belong there. There were no roads leading to it, no tracks in the snow, nothing to suggest anyone had been living in it for a long time. But a single window on the second floor glowed faintly, its frost-covered glass flickering with the dim light of a lantern. I hesitated, every instinct in me screaming to turn back. But the woman, she had been screaming. Maybe she was inside, trapped, hurt. I forced myself forward. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking softly as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the scent of something old and decaying clinging to the walls. My flashlight cast long shadows over the wooden floors, revealing broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, and a staircase that groaned under the weight of time. The silence pressed against my ears. Then, from upstairs, a soft knock against glass. I turned my flashlight toward the second floor. The glow in the window flickered again. Someone was up there. I swallowed the lump in my throat and climbed the stairs, my boots making the wood creak with every step. The hallway stretched out before me, doors lining both sides, all of them closed except one. The last door at the end. It was open, and inside, I could see her. A woman stood by the window, facing away from me. Her long, tangled hair hung over her shoulders, her body stiff as she stared out into the night. She was wearing a thin white dress, too light for the freezing cold. My flashlight wavered in my grip. "Ma'am." My voice sounded wrong in the stillness. "Are you okay?" She didn't move. I took a slow step forward. The air in the room was colder than outside, my breath thickening in front of me. The woman's shoulders rose and fell in uneven breaths. I tried again. "I heard you screaming. Do you need help?" She lifted her hand and pressed it against the window. That's when I saw her reflection. Her face was wrong. Her mouth was open far too wide, stretching unnaturally across her face, her lips cracked and dark. Her eyes, black, hollow pits, locked onto mine through the glass. But she still hadn't turned around. A slow whisper crawled out of her throat. "You should not be here." Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. Her reflection's mouth opened wider. I could hear the wet sound of her jaw unhinging, her breath rattling in her chest. Then she started turning. Not her head, her entire body twisting in one slow, snapping motion, her limbs moving too late, like they were trying to catch up. I ran. I tore down the hallway, my breath ragged, my boots slamming against the floorboards. The walls groaned as if the house itself was shifting. The front door was still open, the cold night waiting outside. Just as I reached the last step, the whispers followed me. "Stay." I slammed into the door, shoving myself through the threshold, gasping as the freezing air hit me. I didn't stop. I ran across the clearing, through the deep snow, until my lungs burned and my legs ached. When I finally reached my camp, I collapsed onto the ground, chest heaving. My tent was still there, my footprints half covered by fresh snowfall. I turned back toward the forest, toward the house, but there was nothing there. No clearing, no house, just endless, untouched snow. I don't know what I saw that night, but sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear it again. A soft knock against glass. Story number 6. The Unfinished Trail. The first thing that made me uneasy was the footprints. We had been hiking through the snow-covered woods for hours, following a marked trail that should have led back to our camp. But as the sun began to set behind the trees, Lucas suddenly stopped, pointing at the ground ahead of us. Those aren't ours. I frowned and followed his gaze. A set of footprints stretched along the path, but they didn't belong to us. They were deeper, older, partially filled in by fresh snowfall. They're heading the same way we are, Ryan muttered, adjusting his backpack. Maybe another hiker passed through earlier, Jake said, though his voice lacked confidence. But something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but a chill ran down my spine as I stared at the prints. They looked too perfect. Evenly spaced, deliberate, as if whoever made them hadn't stopped once. No signs of hesitation, no signs of turning back. And then I noticed something worse. The trail ahead, where the footprints continued, wasn't on our map. Lucas pulled it out, smoothing the crumpled paper with shaking hands. This path isn't marked. Maybe it's an old route, Jake offered. Or a shortcut. Ryan shook his head. Number. That doesn't make sense. This area is supposed to loop back toward camp, not whatever the hell this is. The wind howled through the trees, and I realized how quiet everything had become. No birds, no rustling branches, just the heavy stillness of the snow-covered forest. We should turn back, I said. Lucas nodded. Agreed. But before we could move, Jake pointed ahead. Wait. Look. Through the thickening snowfall, a dark shape loomed in the distance. A house. It sat nestled between gnarled trees, its roof weighed down by years of ice and neglect. The windows were dark, the wooden walls warped and weathered. It shouldn't have been there. How did we not see this before? Ryan whispered. The footprints led straight to its door. A heavy silence settled between us. The house didn't belong. It felt like something that had been forgotten, buried under time and snow, waiting for someone to stumble upon it. Jake, always the reckless one, took a step forward. We need to check it out. Maybe there's a radio or supplies. No, I said sharply, my gut twisting. We leave. Now. Lucas backed me up. This isn't right. None of this is right. But Jake was already moving. 5 minutes, he called over his shoulder. If it's empty, we go. Reluctantly, we followed. The air around the house felt thicker, colder than the rest of the forest. The closer we got, the harder it was to breathe. My fingers ached, even inside my gloves. The door was slightly open, swaying with the wind. Inside, the air was stale and wrong, like something that had been trapped for too long. The walls were covered in carvings, hundreds of them. Jagged, uneven symbols, gouged deep into the wood. Some looked like eyes, others looked like people, tall, stretched figures with elongated limbs. My stomach churned. Ryan's flashlight flickered as he swept it over the floor. Snow had blown inside, settling in thin patches over the wooden planks. The footprints we had followed led into the house, but there were no footprints leading out. Lucas exhaled shakily. We shouldn't be here. The wind picked up outside, rattling the walls. A floorboard creaked. I turned sharply toward the sound, my heart hammering. Then I saw it. A door at the end of the hallway, slightly open. Beyond it, something moved. It was subtle, just the shift of a shadow, a flicker of motion in the dim light. But I knew something was there, watching, waiting. Jake took another step forward, and the whisper came. You're not supposed to be here. It slithered through the air, soft, almost carried by the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was inside the house. I grabbed Jake's arm, yanking him back. We have to go. Now. Ryan was already moving, shoving Lucas toward the door. The house seemed smaller now, the walls pressing in. The carvings on the walls looked deeper, as if they had been freshly carved while we stood there. Then the door at the end of the hallway creaked open wider. The darkness beyond it shifted. A hand, too long, too thin, reached out, pressing against the wooden frame. We ran. Snow blasted into my face as we burst outside, our boots sinking deep as we sprinted away from the house. The wind screamed through the trees, the cold burning my lungs. I didn't look back. I couldn't. We ran until we saw the real trail again, our tracks leading back to camp. We didn't stop until we reached our tents, gasping, shaking, our bodies numb from more than just the cold. When we finally turned back toward the forest, toward where the house should have been, there was nothing. No clearing, no structure, just endless, untouched snow. I don't know where we went that night. I don't know what we saw. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear it. That whisper. You're not supposed to be here. Story number 7. The other campfire. The fire wasn't ours. That was the first thing I noticed when I stepped out of my tent. The night was silent, the kind of quiet that makes the world feel frozen in time. Our own fire had burned down hours ago, reduced to glowing embers. But across the clearing, just beyond the tree line, another fire flickered. A new one. I stared at it, heart thudding. Guys, wake up. Lucas groaned, rolling over in his sleeping bag. What is it now? Ryan sat up, rubbing his eyes. What's wrong? I pointed past the trees. There's another fire. Someone's out there. Jake pushed open his tent flap, peering into the darkness. His face scrunched in confusion. I thought we were the only ones up here. We were. We had hiked deep into the wilderness, miles from any other campers. No signs of people, no paths leading to another group. The snow around us was untouched except for our own tracks. But someone else was here. Ryan grabbed his flashlight and shined it towards the fire. Hello? His voice felt small against the vast emptiness of the night. No response. The fire crackled, its flames too still, too controlled. There were shapes sitting around it, dark figures, unmoving. My stomach twisted. What if they need help? Jake hesitated, then exhaled sharply. Only one way to find out. None of us wanted to go alone. We moved together, our boots crunching softly in the snow as we approached the other campfire. The air felt thicker the closer we got, the cold biting deeper into my skin. And then I saw it. My stomach dropped. The fire wasn't just similar to ours. It was exactly the same. The same makeshift stone ring. The same half-burnt log resting at the edge. The same scattered footprints around it. A perfect replica of our campsite. Lucas whispered, "What the hell?" Then the figures turned. There were 4 of them, and they looked exactly like us. My breath hitched. The duplicates sat in the same positions we had been in earlier that night, their faces eerily blank, their eyes hollow and dark. My copy sat cross-legged, staring into the fire. Jake's double leaned back against a tree, his arms crossed. Lucas's stood just behind his chair, head tilted slightly. Ryan's copy was looking right at me. I stepped back, my pulse hammering. This isn't real. This isn't... The wind shifted. The flames flickered, and the copies stood up. I don't remember moving. Don't remember making the decision to run. But suddenly, we were sprinting. Snow kicked up around us, the trees blurring as we tore through the darkness. I could hear the others panting, their boots pounding against the frozen ground. And behind us, footsteps. They were following. A shape lunged at me from the side. I caught a glimpse of my own face, expressionless, empty, before I shoved it away, its body unnaturally light. It didn't make a sound when it hit the ground. Ryan yelled, The tents. Go. We stumbled into our camp, breathless, slamming into our tents. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my grip. The other fire was gone. No footprints, no signs of movement, nothing. Jake doubled over, gasping. That wasn't real. Tell me that wasn't real. None of us answered. The wind howled through the trees, whispering something I couldn't understand. I barely slept that night, my mind replaying the sight of my own face staring back at me. By morning, the snow had covered any evidence that anything had been there. But I know what we saw. And sometimes, when the fire burns too low, I swear I see them again, just beyond the tree line, waiting. Story number 8. The Shadow in the Snow. The first time I saw it, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The snow stretched out in an endless white blanket, undisturbed except for my own footprints leading back to my tent. The air was still, heavy with silence, the kind that makes the world feel abandoned. I had woken up before dawn, stepping out to relieve myself when I noticed it. A shadow, not mine. It was imprinted in the snow, a dark, human-shaped stain without a source. I stood frozen, my breath fogging in front of me. The early morning light was dim, but there was no mistaking it. Someone had been standing there. But there were no footprints leading to or away from it. Just the shadow. A trick of the light, I told myself. The snow was uneven, the rising sun playing tricks on my tired mind. I shook it off, heading back into my tent. But I didn't sleep after that. By the time the others woke up, the shadow had faded, covered by fresh snowfall. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Until that night. The wind had picked up, rattling the branches, the cold seeping through our layers despite the fire burning strong. We sat close, eating quietly, exhaustion settling in from the long hike. Then Lucas frowned, staring past the flames. "Do you see that?" I turned, following his gaze. There, just beyond the reach of our firelight, was another shadow. Not a person, just a shadow imprinted in the snow. Ryan stood, grabbing his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but the moment the light touched it, it moved. Not like something walking away. It just shifted like a mirage flickering in and out of existence. Then it was gone. Lucas let out a sharp breath. "Tell me you saw that." None of us spoke. The fire crackled, the only sound in the suffocating silence. Jake exhaled shakily. That was weird. But it's probably nothing. None of us believed that. We stayed up late, taking turns watching the woods, but the shadows didn't return. Not that night. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. We packed up and moved deeper into the mountains, trying to push the unease from our minds. But no matter how far we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Not by something I could see, but by something that was always there. The third night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Software crunching against the snow. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, my heart hammering in my chest. The wind had died down, making the footsteps even clearer, circling the tents. I reached for my flashlight with shaking fingers, then stopped. Through the thin fabric of my tent, I saw a shadow. Not a person, just the shadow. It didn't move, just stood there, dark and formless, waiting. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to breathe. My hand tightened around the flashlight. 1, 2, 3. I unzipped the tent and shined the light outside. Nothing, just the empty snow. No footprints, no marks, no shadow. The next morning, I told the others. Lucas's face was pale. "I saw it too," he admitted. "I thought I was dreaming." Ryan didn't say anything. He just packed up faster than usual. By the fourth night, the shadows weren't just appearing in the snow. They were appearing inside our camp. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shapes across the ground. We sat in silence, barely speaking, the unease growing thicker with each passing hour. Then I noticed it, a shadow by the fire, too close. It stretched along the ground between us, unmoving. I swallowed hard. "Who's casting that?" Jake frowned. "What are you talking about?" "The shadow, right there." He followed my gaze. His face went pale. The fire flickered and the shadow twitched. Ryan grabbed his pack. "We're leaving. Now." Lucas didn't argue. None of us did. We grabbed our gear in a panic, shoving everything into our bags as fast as we could. The shadows moved now, flickering in and out, shifting without reason. The fire dimmed with every second. As I turned to grab my last bag, I saw a shape standing at the edge of the camp. Tall, still, featureless. Not a person, just a shadow standing upright, watching. I didn't stop running until the sun rose. When we finally made it back to the base of the mountain, we checked the snow behind us. There were no footprints, but there were shadows. Waiting. Story number 9. The Frozen Face. The first time I saw it, I thought it was a trick of the light. The lake stretched out before me, frozen solid, its surface smooth and glassy beneath the winter moon. The others were still setting up camp, laughing and talking behind me. But I had wandered closer to the ice, drawn by something I couldn't quite explain. Then I saw it. A face beneath the ice. Mouth open in a silent scream, eyes wide, frozen in horror. The features were sharp, clear, too detailed to be a trick of my imagination. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. The lake was deep, the kind that didn't freeze all the way through, but the face wasn't distorted by water or movement. It was just there, staring up at me. "Hey, you good?" I jumped. Lucas had come up beside me, frowning as he followed my gaze. "What are you looking at?" I turned back to the ice. The face was gone. The surface of the lake was smooth, unbroken. I swallowed hard. I thought I saw something. Lucas raised an eyebrow but didn't push. "Come on, we're making a fire." I followed him back to camp, shaking off the unease. I told myself it was nothing, just my tired mind playing tricks. But that night, as we sat around the fire, I kept glancing towards the lake, and I wasn't the only one. Ryan was quieter than usual, staring into the darkness. Finally, he spoke. "Did any of you hear something earlier?" Jake smirked. "You scared of the wind." Ryan didn't laugh. "Number, it wasn't the wind. It was knocking." Lucas shifted. "Knocking?" Ryan nodded slowly. "From under the ice." A heavy silence settled over us. I felt the chill creep back into my bones. Jake scoffed, tossing another log into the fire. "It's just the ice shifting. It makes noise when it freezes over." But Ryan wasn't convinced, and neither was I. That night I barely slept. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the tents, but beneath it I thought I heard something else. A soft, rhythmic knocking. In the morning, the unease hadn't left me. I stepped outside, my boots crunching in the snow, and turned toward the lake. There, standing right at the edge, was a trail of footprints, leading from our camp to the ice. I swallowed hard. The others were still asleep. I hesitated before stepping forward, following the prints. They stopped exactly where I had stood the night before, where I had seen the face. I knelt down, brushing the snow from the surface of the ice. My breath caught. The face was back, but it wasn't the same. The mouth was open wider, the eyes filled with something desperate, like it was trying to scream. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, but beneath it, a knock. From under the ice. I turned and ran. Lucas and the others were just waking up as I reached camp, my breaths ragged. I grabbed Ryan's arm. "The face," I gasped. "It's still there." Jake frowned. "What face?" Ryan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket and followed me back to the lake. But when we got there, the ice was perfectly smooth. No footprints, no face, just endless, untouched snow. Ryan exhaled shakily. "We need to go." Jake laughed. "Seriously? Over a weird dream?" Ryan didn't answer. That night, I woke up to the sound of something scratching against my tent. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, too afraid to move. The sound circled the tent once, twice, then stopped. Then came the whisper, "Help me." I shot up, gasping. The camp was silent, the fire still glowing faintly. I forced myself to step outside, scanning the darkness. And then I saw them. Footprints, leading from my tent back to the lake. I followed them, my body moving before my mind could stop it. The ice loomed ahead, shimmering under the moonlight, and the face was right beneath my feet. But this time, it was mine. My own frozen face, staring up at me, mouth twisted in horror. The ice cracked. The last thing I heard before I ran was a single, deafening knock. The next morning, we left. We didn't talk about it. We didn't look back. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I still hear it. Knocking. Waiting. Story number 10. The man who never leaves. The first time we met him, we thought he was just another camper. The storm had forced us to stop early, setting up our tents in a small clearing. The snow was relentless, thick and heavy, making everything feel muffled and distant. We had just started a fire when he walked out of the woods. A tall man, bundled in a heavy coat, his face shadowed beneath a hood. His steps were slow, deliberate, like he had been walking for a long time. "Mind if I sit?" His voice was low, calm. None of us answered at first. Something about him unsettled me, but I pushed it down. We were in the middle of nowhere. Maybe he had gotten lost. Maybe he needed company. Jake scooted over, making room by the fire. "Yeah, sure." The man sat, his gloved hands resting on his knees. The firelight flickered against his face, but the shadows clung to him in a way that didn't seem right. He never pushed back his hood. "You boys hiking the ridge?" Ryan nodded. "Yeah. Got caught in the storm, though." The man let out a slow breath. "Storms up here last longer than you think." Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. We talked for a bit, about the cold, the hike, the best spots to camp. But something was off. He never spoke about where he had come from, where he was headed. He never said his name, and he never ate. Even when Jake offered him some jerky, he just shook his head. Not hungry. The fire crackled between us, the cold creeping in from the trees. After a while, the man stood. "I'll be seeing you," he murmured. Then he turned and walked back into the woods. No flashlight, no gear, just gone. We didn't sleep well that night. By morning, we had convinced ourselves it was nothing, just a strange guy passing through. But when we packed up and hiked further into the mountains, we reached our next campsite and stopped dead. He was already there, sitting by the fire, waiting. The same heavy coat, the same shadowed face. Jake let out a nervous laugh. How did you know?" The man smiled. "Told you I'd be seeing you." None of us moved. It didn't make sense. We had hiked miles from the last site through deep snow on an unmarked trail. There was no way he could have beaten us here. Lucas whispered, "We should go back." But the man just chuckled, shaking his head. No use. You'll always end up here. The fire flickered, the wind howling through the trees. Ryan took a step forward. Who are you? The man tilted his head as if considering. I'm the one who never leaves. Then he smiled, and his teeth were wrong. Too many, too sharp. The fire died. We ran. The cold burned my lungs, my legs screaming as we tore through the snow. The trees blurred around us, the wind deafening. I didn't know where we were going, just away. But no matter how far we ran, how many turns we took, the landscape never changed. The same trees, the same clearing, the same fire waiting for us. And him. He was already sitting again, hands folded neatly, watching, waiting. Jake dropped to his knees, gasping. What the hell is this? The man leaned forward. You still don't get it? The wind screamed, the sky darkening. You were never going to leave. I turned, trying to retrace our steps, but there were no footprints behind us. Only snow. Only silence. Only him. Story number 11. The thing beneath the ice. We should have never stepped onto that lake. The ice stretched wide and smooth beneath the pale winter moon, an endless sheet of white and blue reflecting the darkness above. It looked solid, untouched, a perfect frozen mirror. But something about it made my stomach turn. Jake was the first to suggest it. Bet none of you have the guts to walk to the middle. Lucas scoffed, shoving his hands in his pockets. You're an idiot. Ryan grinned. Come on, it's solid, we'll be fine. I didn't want to go. I wanted to tell them something was wrong, but I didn't. I just swallowed my unease and stepped onto the ice with the others. It felt sturdy at first, the cold biting through my boots. We took careful steps, listening for any crack, any shift beneath us. The lake was vast, stretching so far into the trees that the other side was swallowed by darkness. Then Jake stopped. Did you hear that? We froze. A sound, a deep, hollow knock. It came from beneath us. Lucas laughed nervously. It's just the ice settling. Then it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was slow, deliberate, not the random groan of shifting ice. It was rhythmic, like something was knocking to be let out. Ryan whispered, "Let's get off this thing." We turned, stepping back toward shore. The ice shuddered beneath our feet. Then a shadow moved beneath us. A dark shape, deep under the ice, drifting below our feet. Jake cursed, stumbling backward. What the hell is that? We all saw it now. Something huge, shifting beneath the surface. The ice was thick, but the shadow was clearer than it should have been, like it was just inches away. And it was following us. I felt my breath hitch as the shadow grew larger. It wasn't swimming. It wasn't moving like something alive. It was rising. I ran. The others weren't far behind. Our boots skidded on the ice, breaths coming out in sharp gasps. The knocking turned into pounding, heavy and urgent, as if something massive was slamming against the ice from below. I didn't dare look down. We were halfway to shore when we heard it. A crack. Not a small one. Not a splintering whisper. A deep, deafening crack that split the night. Jake screamed. I turned in time to see him disappear. The ice beneath him had given way, swallowed him whole into the black water. For a second, there was nothing. Just the hole in the ice, jagged and gaping. Then, his hand shot up, clawing at the edge. He was struggling, gasping, his breath ragged and panicked. "Pull me up!" Ryan lunged forward, grabbing one of Jake's arms, but his eyes suddenly widened in horror. "Something's..." Jake screamed. Something pulled him down. I saw it. A hand, not human, wrapped around his ankle. long, gnarled fingers with skin like wet stone dragging him into the dark. He thrashed, kicking, but it yanked harder. Then he was gone. The ice sealed over. No ripples, no air bubbles, just smooth, untouched ice. We ran. We didn't stop until we were back at camp, shaking, gasping, our bodies burning with cold and fear. No one spoke. No one moved. At dawn, we went back. The ice was perfect. No cracks. No signs of a struggle. No sign that Jake had ever been there. But when I knelt down and pressed my hand to the surface, I felt it. A slow, rhythmic knock from beneath. If you made it this far, you're one of the brave ones. But tell me, have you ever experienced something unexplainable? A moment that sent chills down your spine? Share your horror stories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that keeps you up at night. More terrifying tales are waiting for you. Click on the videos appearing on your screen now, if you dare.